My name is Jason Hooper from FixYourGut.com, and today we're going to be talking about leaky gut. Now, if you do a Google search and you just say, what is leaky gut? You're going to come up with a bunch of people trying to sell you things, and then the first actual site that provides you with any kind of medical information is going to be WebMD. And that's just the way that Google does their search engine. You know, they like to bring up the mainstream sites, and if there's any sort of dissenting information, it's going to be on page like 179 or something along those lines. So we're going to compare and contrast a source from WebMD, which is highly ranked by Google, with an article from PubMed, which you'd have to scroll through many, many pages. And we're just going to compare some of the opinions and research that's cited by both sites, and just kind of as an experiment, and maybe learn more about leaky gut. So the first thing is that leaky gut is just, I think one of the issues is it's just a bad name. It's a bad, it doesn't sound very scientific, like leaky gut, and so that's part of the issue. Where do people take it seriously, and maybe not, because it just sounds weird. So maybe we should come up with like a new name for leaky gut or something else, and maybe that's an idea. Anyway, let's go on to this first article from WebMD, and they lead off by saying leaky gut syndrome is said to have symptoms including bloating, gas, cramps, food sensitivities, and aches and pains. But it's something of a medical mystery. So of those, I would really only consider the last two as being caused by leaky gut. And I would say the first three, bloating, gas, cramps, are probably causing the leaky gut, not necessarily being a product of it. So already we have issues with this. They go on by saying, and this is from Donald Kirby, who's a medical doctor and the director of the Center for Human Nutrition at the Cleveland Clinic. He says, from an MD standpoint, it's a very gray area. Physicians don't know enough about the gut, which is our biggest immune system organ. Okay, so Dr. Kirby is a gastroenterologist. So for him to say something like, we just don't know very much about the gut is a little odd to me, because that's his area of expertise. Dr. Kirby goes on to say, leaky gut syndrome isn't a diagnosis taught in medical school. Instead, leaky gut really means you've got a diagnosis that still needs to be made. You hope that your doctor is a good enough Sherlock Holmes, but sometimes it's very hard to make a diagnosis. So yeah, I definitely empathize with doctors that are dealing with gut health issues, because it is a lot of troubleshooting, and it's not always so clear cut as to what the problems are. And it can be extremely confusing, and sometimes to work within the basic bounds of medical science and within the medical board in that community, it's very hard to get the job done. So I get that part. So let's go on. This is from Dr. Linda A. Lee, who's a medical doctor and gastroenterologist and director of the Johns Hopkins Integrative Medicine and Digestive Center. She says, we don't know a lot, but we know that it exists. In the absence of evidence, we don't know what it means or what therapies can directly address it. So her take on it is basically like, hey, we know this is a thing, but we don't know anything about it, and we don't know how to fix it, which is a big problem. So what do you do? This next section is just baffling to me, and they have an entire section on intestinal permeability. And let's read on. It says, a possible cause of leaky gut is increased intestinal permeability or intestinal hyperpermeability. And to me, that's the weirdest statement that anybody could make about leaky gut. Just to form an analogy, and I think this is a fair comparison, saying like the cause of bleeding is blood escaping the skin. Like, of course, that's what bleeding is, like, of course, leaky gut is intestinal permeability or hyperpermeability. It's not anything else. That's not what causes it. That's what it actually is. It's leaky gut. So they go on to say it could happen when the tight junctions in the gut, which control what passes through the lining of the small intestines, don't work properly. That could let substances leak into the bloodstream. Okay, yeah, that's part of it. The tight junctions open and closing, but there's plenty of substrates that don't enter the bloodstream that way, that actually come in through other passageways, through transport proteins in the epithelium. And it also doesn't address the mucosal membrane at all either. So it's a very one-dimensional way to look at a very complex system. People with celiac disease and Crohn's disease experience this. Molecules can get across in some cases, such as Crohn's, but we don't know all the causes, Dr. Lee says. Whether hyperpermeability is more of a contributing factor or a consequence is unclear. Yeah, again, it's just dumbfounding, where it's like, we don't know if leaky gut causes leaky gut or if leaky gut causes leaky gut. But why or how this would happen in someone without those conditions is not clear. Well, maybe we'll get some answers to that later on in this video. Little is known about other causes of leaky gut that aren't linked to certain type of drugs, radiation therapy, or food allergies. All right, the next section is just called Unsolved Mystery. Leaky gut symptoms aren't unique. They're shared by other problems too, and tests often fail to uncover a definite cause of the problem that can leave people without a diagnosis and therefore untreated. Yeah, I agree with that. That happens all the time. People go in and they don't get a diagnosis and they don't get treatment. They just say, well, that sucks for you. See you later. Thanks for your copay. We go back to Dr. Kirby here. Dr. Kirby says, it's crucial to find a doctor who will take time with you and take your concerns seriously. Yeah, isn't that the truth? To find somebody who won't just say you're crazy and push you out the door, that'll actually listen to your concerns and try to help you somehow. You may have leaky gut, and we may be able to treat what causes it. If you have something going on, it's incumbent upon the medical community to listen to you. That makes a ton of sense, And then Lee chimes in, and Lee says, unfortunately, not all doctors make the effort to get to the root of the problem, and that's what frequently sends patients to alternative practitioners. Well, of course, if you're not going to do anything to help a patient, they're going to get help someplace else. And I don't know why we have to look so negatively towards alternative practitioners when they're actually taking the time to help people and they're getting results. So if you're not happy with that, then do something about it, right? Listen to your patients, try something, try to get a better result. Otherwise, you should be sending them to alternative practitioners because they're the ones that are making patients better. Lee goes on to say, often the reason they have resorted to alternative medicine is because of what they've been told and how they've been treated by other practitioners. We need to listen. So yeah, I mean, what do you expect is going to happen? I guess like if you want to be, if you want to be somebody's doctor, you got to earn it, right? You can't just ignore them and send them on their way. Say, well, just live with this. I can't help you. They're going to get help somehow. And I'm grateful that there are people out there beyond that space that want to listen to doctors. And I don't want to say that all doctors do this, of course, because, I mean, if you listen to Kirby obviously gets it. And, I doubt he's just sending patients out into the streets, and saying like, well, can't help you. Sorry. It's just too much of a mystery for me or something. And that's not even really what they say. Doctors don't like not having the answer. And so if they don't have the answer to something, they claim it doesn't exist. It's like, there's no problem. So yeah, that's the issue. So yeah, I don't understand why there's such a battle between the alternative practitioners and mainstream medical. I think they should be working together. The next section is treatment without research. In her clinic, Lee combines conventional medicine with evidence-based complementary therapies. That sounds like alternative medicine to me. But with leaky gut, she says, the evidence about what causes it and how to treat it has yet to fully accumulate. This is something that is essential for patients to understand. I don't know. Later on this video, we're going to look at some evidence, and you can make your own decisions based upon whether or not that's evidence or misinformation or whatever. We're in the infancy of understanding what to do. People who are making claims about what to do are doing so without evidence. Well, even if their evidence is, I tried this with this patient and they got better, and then I tried it again with this patient and they got better, and I did this 100 times and they all got better, that's still evidence, okay? So I just don't know what would qualify in her mind as evidence, or you know, what is all this other stuff to her? For example, many websites offering information on leaky gut recommend taking L-glutamine supplements to strengthen the lining of the small intestine. Lee says that theoretically that makes sense given glutamine's role in intestinal function, but there's no research to back up such claims. Or is there? There's no evidence that if I give you a pile of glutamine pills that you will improve, Lee says. So the issue is we've gone beyond the Socratic method about empirical observation, and we're just deciding what's evidence and what's not evidence, okay? If I can observe it with my eyes and I can duplicate the results according to the Socratic method, that's evidence, okay? If you don't like the evidence, I'm sorry. But in many of these cases, like, why wouldn't you like this evidence? Like, why wouldn't you like that glutamine helps heal the gut? The final section, lifestyle may matter. Treating the underlying condition, such as Crohn's or celiac disease, will often resolve symptoms associated with the condition. But without a firm diagnosis, a doctor's hands are often tied by lack of evidence. So, like, does Crohn's disease and celiac cause leaky gut, or does leaky gut cause Crohn's and celiac? So you're saying we're treating these as symptoms of a greater problem? It's just kind of a weird way of thinking about this. Diet likely plays a big role in having a leaky gut. Lee and Kirby agree. So if you have symptoms of leaky gut, you would do well to see a gastroenterologist who is also trained in nutrition. So how many gastroenterologists are also trained in nutrition? I would like to know that, because it seems like you have nutritionists, which concentrate in their area, and then you have gastroenterologists, which concentrate on their area, and there's really not a lot that do both, you know, and they also tend to disagree with one another, which is another problem. Chronic stress may also be a factor, Lee says. You need to tend to your stress, whether it's through medication or meditation. That's what you need to focus on. Yeah, you could meditate, and you know, you could medicate, or you could just cut stress out, you know. That's another option too. You could scale back on some of the things that are stressing you out if you can. Lee says that lifestyle modifications, such as those that reduce stress and improve diet, may be among the best ways to treat leaky gut, particularly when no underlying condition is identified. Chronic health problems are so often due to lifestyle. And we don't have pills for those, she says. We're talking about the way we live and the way we eat. So yeah, that's true. You can't take a pill that will reduce chronic stress, even though in the earlier paragraph she says that you could medicate it. There are some supplements that you can take, and there are some medications that might support healthy stress levels, but making that modification, making that change is often necessary, and unfortunately it's also very difficult. So stress will oftentimes increase motility in the gut. And so when bowel transit becomes too fast, a lot of time that makes it easier for the mucosal membrane to erode and for the tight junctions to open up even more. And we're going to look at some studies later on that look at marathon runners and their leaky gut issues with the stress of endurance racing and how that affects things. Now, the things that we're doing might not be as severe as marathon running, but you might have contributing stress factors in your life that are messing with your motility, increasing your C function, or maybe the opposite. Maybe you're becoming constipated, and that can be, unfortunately, another way leaky gut happens. So you're trying to get into this Goldilocks zone of not too fast, not too slow, but just right. So the dissenting opinion that I'm going to bring up is from a medical doctor named Michael Camarelleri, who was funded with a grant from the National Institute of Health to tackle the subject of leaky gut. And in this paper, he cites 136 different sources and compiles a lot of information, puts it together, and tries to draw conclusions based on what he's seeing in many, many different sources in a very broad area that is leaky gut. So let's look at the introduction. The objective of this review is to address 3 questions based on data almost exclusively acquired in humans. What does the leaky gut mean? Should clinicians diagnose leaky gut? And if so, how can it be diagnosed? Is the leaky gut treatable? There are vast numbers of papers that link leaky gut with altered microbia. There are vast numbers of papers that link leaky gut with altered microbiota in disease models and in experimental animals, from allergy to non-alcoholic. So he goes on to talk about, and he talks about this fairly extensively with some of the websites that address leaky gut and how they address it. And it basically says that it's because your microbiome is out of whack and you have to have the right balance, but they don't really talk about what that balance is. And so he's very critical of this, and I think he should be, because but he addresses some of this later, and he starts talking about some research that he's found that specifically addresses some of this. And to be honest, I'm even critical of that research because I don't think it quite goes deep enough for balance issues. I think we need to go way beyond the phylum level when we start talking about to the firmicute ratios and all that kind of stuff. We need to be more specific. Anyway, he goes on to discuss some treatment options that are often recommended, such as removing foods like gluten, sugar, and dairy, replacing foods less likely to irritate the gut, and including fermented foods such as sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, kefir, pickles, and their healing foods. Repair the damage with supplements, L-glutamine, heal the intestinal lining, vitamin D, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids such as fish oil. Repopulate your good gut bacteria, probiotics, or get a transplant from another person. One of the biggest leaky gut red flags is having issues with a variety of foods. Talk with your healthcare provider. You might have leaky gut syndrome. Do not, however, try to treat this yourself. So I think, yeah, I mean, you can see this all over the place, and I think that some of it has merit and some of it does not. He even talks about later about some of the websites that talk about like eating dirt to heal the gut, and he's very critical of homeostatic soil-based organisms, as we are on FixYourGut.com. We strongly urge people to avoid those and not use those for treatment, and all sorts of other things. So let's go on and see what he has to say. Despite the recommendation to not self-treat, there are many resources, books, and articles with recommendations on restoring the healthy balance, including eating dirt, curing with candida, and education about the microbiome and the human superorganism and the good gut. Given the current perceptions of leaky gut that appear informed and mostly by folklore or overreaching conclusions based on limited data, it is important to provide a balanced view of the scientific data to facilitate the role of clinicians in addressing nature, diagnosis, and treatment of abnormal intestinal barrier functions in humans. To address this, it's important to characterize the intestinal barrier, the pathways between through the epithelial cells, and the measurement of intestinal permeability in humans. This provides the basis for examination of non-intestinal diseases characterized as stress that can really break the barrier, and review possible treatments including diet, natural substances, and medications. All right, so in this paper, he's going to go into a lot of the claims that have been made by some of the websites that he criticizes, and maybe are diluting the water, so to speak, and he's trying to get the good information out that's backed by research and maybe dispel some of the other stuff. So as we go through this, we're going to look at some of those studies and see what he has found is evidence-based research and maybe some articles that sort of rebuke some of the claims made by some of these alternative health sites. So, in the next section, he talks about the intestinal barrier. The intestinal barrier is a dynamic entity interacting with and responding to various stimuli. It consists of multiple elements. And he talks about the lumen, the microclimate, epithelial cells, Paneth cells, lipooliosaccharides, IgA, cytokines, chemokines, and mast cell proteases, endocrine and secretomotor mechanisms, intestinal propulsive motility, serotonin, histamine, and cannabinoids. So he just talks about the basic building blocks of the gut barrier, and then sort of all of these other things that can influence the barrier, allowing things to come in and out and so on. So then he goes and talks about the mucus layer specifically. He notes that the mucus layer is thicker in the colon. He says that bifidobacteria can enhance the barrier and function. There's certain yeasts that have beneficial effects on intestinal microbia and help with the epithelial barrier. Talks about E. coli And he mentions strains that can help and strains that can hurt. So he talks about E. coli and Nestle, which, there's a lot of different strains of E. coli. And he says this one stimulates the TJ protein. Whereas there's other strains like the E. coli strain C25, which seems to harm increase intestinal permeability, which in the case of leaky gut is a bad thing. So in the next section, he provides us with some pictures of what's going on and kind of explains everything so that you can visually get an idea of what's happening. So the first graphic that he includes talks about the pastial junctional complex and how it seals particular spaces in between the epithelial cells. Okay, so if you look at it, you see at the top, you've got the apical junctional complex, and then the epithelial cells are beneath it. And you can see the epithelial cells, like the oval-shaped things, and the areas in between those are where the tight junctions occur. So then he takes an actual picture of the system using an electron microscope, and then he creates a graph to illustrate what's happening there that's less like grainy and easier to understand, but represents the picture that we're seeing here. So from this electron micrograph, he makes this graphic which shows the space in between these epithelial cells. And he talks about the interactions between desmoglein, desmocolin, desmoplakin, and keratin filaments. And these are sort of the things that kind of connect things together and or allow transport to take place in between the cells horizontally, not just vertically, from the intestines into the epithelium or vice versa from the body into the epithelium, but what happens in between, which is important if you're going to understand leaky gut. So then he creates another graphic here, and he kind of shows sort of like what happens, in between the epithelium. And if you look here, it says like in between the epithelium cells, it's where ions and water can pass through. So like calcium, magnesium, sodium pass through, water passes through. Sometimes the gut has to flush something out and takes water from the body and pushes it into the intestines to flush out an irritant. And there are certain transport mechanisms that happen ionically that occur, that need to happen quickly, that can't pass through the epithelial cells and then into the intestines, that has to open up and allow these things to happen for expediency. He also talks about antigens. And so, these antigens that are going into the tight junctions, that's sort of a way for the body's immune system to figure out what's happening in the gut. It's sort of a window into what's going on there. And that's sort of the first line of observation inside of the gut for what we have there. Then he addresses what would happen if you have some sort of erosion of the barrier or an ulcer. And he talks about bacteria macromolecules and how those can either enter the epithelium or pass through the tight junctions. And I guess the hypothesis that he's researching is, can bacteria produce toxins that can pass through the tight junctions and cause our bodies harm? So at the very top, we have a mucus layer that's preventing microbial adhesion. And it's sort of not just to provide a defense against bacteria, but it's also to just kind of seal off the top to be that first layer of defense. And there are also properties within the mucosal membrane that allow activation of the immune system through IgG, IgA, and the mucosal membrane can fight bacteria without even addressing the epithelial cells, which I think is kind of cool. So imagine, though, what happens if that gets stripped away? Well, that first layer of defense is gone, and then it's up to the antigens and the immune system reacting through the tight junctions to deal with whatever's going on the surface. So obviously the mucosal membrane is very important, and so I think it's great that he goes on to describe how this mucosal membrane is created. He talks about the goblet cells and how it's the first physical defense in the barrier. He talks about different genes that are responsible for creating the proteins that form the mucosal membrane. MUC2, MUC3, MUC4, MUC12, MUC13, MUC17. Lots of different genes that are all working to create mucosal membrane. So why would that gene be expressed? And how is there anything that would cause it to not be expressed, meaning that we don't make enough mucus or these proteins to form the membrane? So he goes in and starts talking about the goblet cells and the different channel regulators, like CLCA1, FCGBP, GZ16, all of these different genes that work with the body's immune system that are kind of using the antigens to sense the presence of bacteria or something so that it signals the goblet cells to start creating more mucus. And, that's one of the hypotheses. And this is not in the paper at all. This is just me talking. This is one of the hypotheses about why certain probiotics work, is because they're stimulating the immune system in this mechanism. So the body's like responding to the presence of these bacteria, even a probiotic where the bacteria are no longer alive. You're just eating dead bacteria, and your epithelial cells are sort of responding to this by creating more mucus to protect everything. So that's one of the thoughts on that. He also talks about immune regulators and antimicrobial proteins. And then surfactants. Surfactants are really important. These are, in this case, we're talking mostly about bile salts, because the bile salts are what we call amphiphils. And we need these amphiphils because we have to be able to deal with fats and deal with hydrophilic or water-soluble compounds and water itself. Because we're talking about membranes, right? We're talking about barriers. And to create a barrier, you have to be able to have water staying out and the surface. So we need some kind of a lipid or fat in between to separate it, because oils and waters don't mix. And then you have to have some sort of substance that will attract water, because you have to be able to deal with transport somehow. And so the bile salts are extremely important for the mucosal membrane. So he starts talking about when you secrete bile salts, it induces secretion of mucus. And bile salts impact the ability of mucus to serve as a barrier. to hydrophilic and lipophilic compounds. So it's kind of a two-way street, like so it's kind of like a two-way street. It's like the more bile you produce, the more mucus that you're going to produce, but also that bile can also strip the mucus because it is an amphiphile. So, you have to be able to regulate the amount of bile that's being created. It also talks about other goblet cell antagonists that might help create mucus. It talks about histamine, peptide tyrosine or peptide YY, and serotonin. And we've addressed serotonin before, and 5-HTP. So in the next paragraph, he addresses sort of these like food additives that sort of act similarly to bile salts that can erode the mucosal membrane. And these are certain emulsifiers that are found in produced foods to, provide a different consistency or, to blend things together better, and how they can strip away the mucosal membrane as well. And, he says that through the research, some of these have been shown to increase intestinal permeability, which is bad. That's leaky gut. And he talks about some of the common emulsifiers like carboxyl methylcellulose, CMC, and polysorbate 80. How many food products do you see with polysorbate 80? Quite a few. And so I would also look for, there are certain there are sort of like these natural so there's also these like natural emulsifiers that are found, like xanthan gum, that basically do the exact same thing. So perhaps if you have issues with leaky gut, you should avoid these from your diet. In the next paragraph, he talks about dietary emulsifiers that interact with gut microbiome. In the next paragraph, he talks about dietary emulsifiers that may interact with gut microbiota and altered mucus In the next paragraph, he goes on to talk about dietary emulsifiers that may interact with gut microbiota and altered mucus thickness to promote colitis. All right, so how do you test for leaky gut? So according to this research, we can come up with certain saccharides or sugars that are soluble, and we can see that there's no transport mechanism for any way for them to get into the body. And so if we're consuming this and then excreting it through the urine, there's a good chance that they're getting through the tight junctions because there's no known transport mechanism into the cells. So we take a list of all of these saccharide compounds and we look at the size of the molecule, which is measured in angstroms. And the hypothesis is that the bigger the saccharide that's getting through, the wider the tight junctions have to be to allow that to happen. So, if you look at some of these that are really big, then, I guess you have more intestinal permeability. And if you have those that are smaller, then there's less. So the ones that are kind of smaller are like mannitol, which is a sugar alcohol. But then you have bigger ones like lactulose, which is used in a lot of these studies. And then you have sucralose, which is in a lot of food products, which is pretty darn big. So he proposes that if the larger molecules traverse the leak pathway, the latter might also allow passage of the small molecule. And there's no compelling evidence that the different sugars actively traverse the intestinal barrier via different pathways. So this is important because, if we say that lactulose is getting through, well, then mannitol is probably getting through also, and we can measure how much is consumed and how much is being excreted through the urine as opposed to through the stool. So then he talks about other evidence for how we could measure intestinal permeability, and it's going to be through biopsies. You just go and take a chunk of the intestinal barrier and see what's going on. See if the epithelial cells are And he says other approaches quantitate the tight junction proteins in the mucosal biopsies. So there's a couple of different techniques that he describes. One is confocal endomicroscopy. So there's a couple of different techniques that he describes. The first one is confocal endomicroscopy. Endomicroscopy. So there's a couple of different biopsy techniques that he describes. The first one is through confocal endomicroscopy. So there's a couple of different techniques that he describes to be able to do this. The first one is through confocal endomicroscopy. Confocal endomicroscopy. Confocal endomicroscopy. And the second one he talks about is endoscopic mucosal impedance. And he goes on to describe sort of how that works. So then he goes on and talks about the relationship between irritable bowel syndrome and leaky gut. And I find this to be kind of odd also because so then he goes on to talk about some of the literature that he's read on irritable bowel syndrome and leaky gut, which I find this kind of odd because irritable bowel syndrome just covers just too much. Like it's just a blanket for too many different conditions. And so it's really hard to do anything with because under IBS is a subset of conditions that we can actually explore and treat. Whereas IBS is just like saying, you've got gut problems. And he goes on in the next paragraph to say that there are non-gastrointestinal diseases that have been associated with leaky gut based on limited or no supporting data, including asthma, autism, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, eczema, psoriasis. Eosinophilic esophagitis, environmental entropy, fibromyalgia, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, multi-organ failure syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, alcoholic psoriasis, obesity, metabolic syndrome, pancreatitis, and rheumatoid arthritis. So he's later going to evaluate some of these and talk about the possibility of trying to find evidence that would lead to saying like, well, okay, if people with these conditions have leaky gut, they should be able to see evidence of this leaky gut occurring. So are they passing some of these large saccharides through the tight junctions? And if so, that might seem to indicate that there could be correlation there. So he talks about the pro arguments, and he's going to go through a lot of these different conditions and cite studies and just basically go through the literature, and he wants to just see what he can find. So the first one is endurance exercise, marathon running with fecal occult blood or bloody diarrhea. So people who are running marathon, and it's just beyond like runner's trots, like they've gotten to the point where, you know, they've got blood in their stool and it's just really bad. So, and not just marathon running, like he goes through this biking challenge, running challenge, you know, all this other kind of stuff. And he looks at the intestinal permeability markers versus mucosal damage markers. And then if the study addresses it, if there's any sort of intervention or treatment that's in place and the effect of that. So he just goes through and he's saying that like basically people who are running, the LLR increases and intestinal permeability has been increased in pretty much everything that he's finding. Some of the dietary interventions, you know, they've tried to treat this using citrulline, which is an amino acid that upregulates nitric oxide production. And it's saying that it doesn't really have too much effect on this, so that's not so good. Another dietary intervention is sucrose. So just, you know, if you're running a lot, just eat a lot of sugar. And so what that study found is that actually eating sugar increased mucosal damage instead of healed it. And, you know, a lot of endurance athletes will just like consume copious amounts of sugar as they're competing. Like they carry around these packets of like goo where they just like squeeze it in their mouth and it's basically like pure sugar. And that may not be a good thing. He looks at boxing and rugby. And so he looks as a possible treatment, nutraceutical colostrum versus placebo. And the colostrum actually reduced intestinal permeability. And it also seemed to this is in vitro studies, not in vivo studies, but when they tested this on cells in a test tube, basically, it seemed to help the cell linings there. So then the next area that he goes on to is classification of pain medicines called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and he looks at the effect on these and intestinal permeability. And when you take something like ibuprofen, Tylenol, something like this, all the studies that he's shown, like, it increases intestinal permeability. He's finding research that's showing that all of a sudden the saccharides are getting through the tight junctions when they're not supposed to. And he also finds evidence that it's affecting the microbiome too. So these bifidobacterium, which he said earlier, can aid in sealing up the gut and forming more mucus, better mucous membranes. They're sort of going away in response to these medications. He also talks about zinc, and zinc seems to help with this as well. He doesn't talk about the form of zinc. Maybe it's zinc carnosine. That's my guess. He just says zinc. And then oligosaccharides, which are prebiotics that seem to help a lot. And FixYourGut, we recommend certain types of oligosaccharides, and we don't recommend others. Check out FixYourGut.com for more information. So then he talks about pregnancy as a stressor, pregnancy with and without obesity. And he talks about some of the prenatal vitamins that are taken during pregnancy, and maybe those can have a better effect on the gut. A lot of times what happens during pregnancy is that women get constipated, and that can affect leaky gut too, because things aren't moving very quickly and bacteria start to form and they can eat away at the mucosal membrane, and then it opens up some of the tight junctions and stuff. And so this could possibly confirm the effects of omega-3s or other polyunsaturated fatty acids as an aid for somebody with leaky gut. And what he finds is that in combination with omega-3 fatty acids, fiber, and a range of vitamins and minerals, you're seeing a change in the microflora. He doesn't really go into that too much, but says it produces a change in the flora. And then he looks at probiotics as a possibility too, and as a result, not seeing too much change in the mucosal damage. So later on, he talks a little bit about SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and the effect that can have. And he looks at this at a very interesting angle, which we don't really see too awful much. I mean, it can happen, but it's kind of rare, where you have a type of SIBO where you have a particular strain of E. coli that's forming, and it's producing ethanol inside the gut. So even though you're not like consuming ethanol, you're not a drinker, the bacteria in your gut are producing enough ethanol to damage the body. And again, it can happen, yeah, but it's very rare. So he looks at this as maybe a possibility for why we're seeing liver damage. And he says liver disease, and he says liver disease causes a systemic inflammatory response that leads to increased intestinal permeability with bacteria translocation and further hepatic damage. So I would interpret this as saying like it's kind of like a circular system here where the liver gets damaged and then you end up with dysbiosis, and then they produce more ethanol, which damages the liver, and it's just this cycle. Again, I haven't seen this too awful much in the normal population. It's very rare. Goes on to say, in some studies, alteration of the microbiota may result in reduced sensitivity of the diseases in humans. Demonstrated with hepatic psoriasis in response to treatment with Lactobacillus casei, strain Shirota or VSL number 3, which contains 8 lyophilized bacterial strains. So using probiotics as a treatment, Lactobacillus casei is one of the recommended probiotics on FixYourGut, and one of the and we like it because if it becomes opportunistic, it's not that hard to get rid of. So not necessarily like adding more bacteria to the gut, especially in case of SIBO, is not generally a good idea. So you got to be careful with probiotics. You know, there are causes and effects to everything. So, you know, be careful with what you're doing there. So later on, he goes and talks about some other conditions, like aging, for instance. So he looks at aging, and he looks at the ratios between firmicutes and he looks at the ratios between firmicutes and Bacteroidetes, particularly with bifidobacteria, and then colostra in the other case. Now, we're talking about very low resolution information on the bacteria population. This is phylum level stuff. And there's a lot of research on this that's saying like, okay, this ratio is really important, but, you know, they don't really dig too much deeply into, you know, the orders, the gene species, you know, this kind of stuff that, you know, like what is it in this gigantic population of bacteria that's causing the issue. So then he goes into food allergies, and this is like a big claim, and really like with this, are we actually talking about real food allergies like an anaphylactic response, or are we talking about food sensitivities? Not really that clear here, but what he's seeing is some mast cell production of IgE mediated increase in inflammatory cytokines, but this does not address the microbiota whatsoever, so I'm not really sure what this has to do with anything. But when he's looking at children who have these food allergies, they tend to have increased gut permeability. All right, the next topic that he gets into is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So the liver's getting harmed by something, and it's not alcohol. What is it? So he questions whether it could be caused by leaky gut, or toxins coming in through the gut, liver's having to deal with it and being damaged by it. So he says in SIBO, in 37.5% of the cases, we see increased gut permeability, and we also see the occurrence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then he also gets into this theory of ethanol production again, which I don't think it's ethanol that's doing this. I think that it is lipopolysaccharides, LPS, that's doing this. Way more common than the ethanol hypothesis. I think we're knocking at the wrong door there. So then he goes on to looking at cirrhosis, and when somebody has cirrhosis, he's indicating that there are significant changes in the microbiota. But is this the case because the liver's being damaged and the liver produces bile salt, and the bile isn't and the bile isn't stimulating the production of the mucosal membrane? That's what I think it is. I don't think necessarily that it's causal in the other direction. I think that the liver damage needs to be fixed before we can fix the mucosal membrane. I actually have a coaching client right now that's dealing with this too, and working with his doctor on basically having a virus that's attacking the liver and having to deal with that first before we can fix the leaky gut that's occurring. And this sort of protocol that his doctor has him on is addressing the liver first, which I think is pretty smart. And then once we fix the liver, that should kind of fix some other things in the gut. So then he goes on to talk about Alzheimer's disease and the difference between the ratios between bacteroides and the firmicute thing again. Like it's not really high enough resolution to do anything with necessarily, in my opinion. But he's showing that there are differences there. Parkinson's disease. They're saying that people who have Parkinson's disease have intense staining of E. coli in the epithelium, and reduced production of butyrate, which is a short-chain fatty acid. And so we're seeing a reduction in bacteria that produce butyrate, which also is responsible for helping to, it's a short-chain fatty acid, so it's responsible for helping to create some of the mucosal membrane, and an increase in E. coli in Parkinson's patients. And he goes on to talk about ALS and other psychiatric diseases, and we know that in the gut makes double the amount of serotonin that is made in the brain. So if you're having issues in the gut, then yeah, it probably can affect the brain. Not sure what that has to do with leaky gut necessarily, since all these neurotransmitters have transport mechanisms and don't necessarily need to go through the tight junction process. And so he's just making kind of correlations between these two. But then, again, it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the leaky gut that caused the ALS and other psychiatric disease, or vice versa? There's probably definitely issues there. It's not necessarily leaky gut. It could just be dysbiosis in general. So he goes on and looks at the correlations between the microbiota and anxiety and depression. And he also looks at patients with schizophrenia, which, for that, I would be looking more at toxoplasmosis and bipolar disorder. Recently, I've also seen studies about the differences in the microbiota in people with ADHD. And while all of this is really fascinating, I really like all of this research, showing that there are differences in the microbiota. Just because there's differences in the microbiota doesn't necessarily mean there's leaky gut. And so the earlier methods that he had for confirming leaky gut, which was the passage of saccharides that there's no known transport mechanism for, and that are too large to fit through the tight junctions in normal cases. We should be seeing more of that stuff for intestinal permeability or biopsy. And he doesn't really point to either one of these. He's just pointing to like immunomarkers that that indicate that there are antigens that the immune system is responding to, and that there are differences in the microbiota. That's not enough evidence for me to suggest that the leaky gut is causing this stuff. It may be, it may not be. The differences are interesting though, but there's plenty of other things that could be going on besides just leaky gut. Dysbiosis is, again, a very broad thing, and there's a lot of other conditions that it can cause, not just leaky gut. All right, so now we go into the therapeutic methods, and I find this to be very interesting. And the very first thing that he goes into is IV glutamine, which is weird, because it's like, I'm trying to heal the gut, so we're going to give you intravenous glutamine. And so this was being given to patients that basically had to fast before surgery, and so they gave them IV glutamine. Probably the reason why they give it to them is because through gluconeogenesis, it can be converted into saccharides, kind of stabilize the blood sugar that way without necessarily spiking it. So anyway, patients that were given glutamine intravenously that had intestinal permeability did not improve after they were given the IV stuff. So maybe not the best way to deliver the glutamine. So let's look at enteral glutamine. And so he looked at a lot of these burn victims that were given glutamine enterally, and basically he's seeing that it is having some effect. It's lowering LMR, which is good. Glutamines and whey protein are also reducing LMR, according to another study in Crohn's disease patients. And again, the whey protein is probably acting more on IgG and IgA antibodies. So that might be a different kind of deal. All right, so this is the big one, the oral route glutamine. So consuming glutamine orally, as was addressed by some of the physicians in the first study that said, like, okay, there's no proof that oral glutamine is going to do anything for a leaky gut. Well, guess what? We found a study that shows through post-infectious IBS, elevated urinary LMR was normalized in the glutamine, but not in the control group. So we have a double-blind placebo-controlled study that shows that oral route glutamine is helping to fix gut permeability issues in people with IBS. Galacto-oligosaccharides. This is the money supplement for a lot of people. This is one of the better prebiotics out there. And the difference between a prebiotic and a probiotic is the prebiotic feeds bacteria. Probiotic are the bacteria themselves. So they gave people who were obese GOS, and according to the comments listed, they looked at people who were given aspirin and sucralose to lactulose ratios, and the sucralose excretion reduced, which indicates that there was improvement in colonic permeability. So GOS seemed to have a good impact. Then we look at inulin-enriched pasta. So this is fructooligosaccharides, which I don't think are as useful and valuable as GOS, but let's see what happens. So they just gave it to healthy young volunteers, and we see a reduction in serum zonulin and urine LMR, but not mannitol excretion. So we see something happening, but there still appears to be mannitol excretion. So it may seal up a little bit, but not enough to prevent mannitol from going through it. Mannitol is about a third the size of sucralose. So we still have some permeability there. But the issue is with FOS is that it tends to feed a wide range of bacteria, and it's kind of hard to control what's happening there. So it's not very strain specific for helping people. So it may not do what you want it to do. It just feeds a lot of bacteria, not necessarily just the ones that you want. Not that GOS only feeds the good bacteria, but it's just a lot more specific that way, where there's a chance that, you know, you might shift the microbiome in a better direction. So what about just straight up fiber? So we looked at patients with non-fatty acid liver disease that are undergoing diets for prescriptions for obesity, and increasing nutritional fiber from 19 grams to 29 grams per day reduced serum ZO levels and improved hepatic steatosis. Improved hepatic steatosis. So just by adding just insoluble fiber to the diet seems to help keep things moving and help people with liver disease that was not caused by excessive drinking. What about rhubarb? So rhubarb was given to patients who were suffering from burns, and according to this, rhubarb helped control gut permeability and improved in patients that had been burned. So then the next thing that we find are oligosaccharides that have been created by a certain strain of, forget it. All right, let's look at vitamin C. And this is going to make some people very unhappy, but this is just what the research says. And the whole vitamin C community is probably going to, downvote this video because of this, but what this says is that they compared to ascorbic acid to aspirin and looked at and placebo to look at the gut permeability, and the people who were taking oral route vitamin C, compared with the aspirin group. So, aspirin, vitamin C, when people took those, they had greater excretion of lactulose. And remember, lactulose is one of those, larger saccharides that no known transport mechanism. It shouldn't be ended up in the urine, but was able to get through anyway. So similar results from taking oral route vitamin C to aspirin for leaky gut over the control group. And so what that means is maybe we shouldn't be taking oral route vitamin C, particularly not in super large doses. I just don't think that it's a completely side effect free supplement, as a lot of people from the vitamin C forums will claim it is. And I think a lot of the problem is that they're confusing in vitro versus in vivo research, and also IV route vitamin C versus oral route vitamin C. I think they kind of get those confused sometimes and just say, eat as much vitamin C as you want. It may cause leaky gut according to this research. All right, so next he talks about probiotics. He says there's also hope that probiotics or commensal organisms improve intestinal barrier function. However, the evidence to date is sparse, often based on animal models regular in human studies. The beneficial effect may be through the effects of butyrate, and the documented effects have been reported for the organism. Akkermansia muciniphila. There is a microintegral membrane protein, MIMP, that is the smallest domain of surface layer protein from Lactobacillus plantarum. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is used in agriculture, and a lot of feeds and stuff use probiotics to improve the health and yields from the animals. Just because it's being used in animals and agricultural successfully doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be used in us. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that it's not going to, but he couldn't find any evidence to suggest that it is in human studies rather than animal studies. So towards the end of this paper, he plays devil's advocate and talks about the cons of the leaky gut argument, and he lists 4 things that he mentions as, I guess, counter evidence to the previous 30 pages of evidence to support it. So the first thing that he says is that leaky gut could be an epiphenomenon, which means it could be the result of something else, which 100% is true. I mean, it's got to be the result of something, right? And so basically he's saying that sometimes the disease can cause the phenomenon rather than the phenomenon causing the disease. And I think in a lot of the cases described, that definitely could be. Number 2, although allergen stress and physical activity may indeed alter intestinal barrier function, it is unclear how this predisposes to clinical consequences. So yeah, it's not clear because we need to study it more, but in the papers where they've offered treatments, the treatments seem to fix the issue. So I think that would kind of credit the possibility that the stress is harming the integrity of the gut barrier. Number 3, isolation led to disease phenotype in experimental animals models for the disease. So he's talking like, okay, well, these were in animals, and it's an isolated incident, and it doesn't necessarily translate into humans, which is 100% true for those studies, but not for the human studies that were addressed earlier in this paper. So just because some people are using animal studies to make claims for people does not mean we can also discredit the human studies. That's just a logical fallacy. Number 4, intervention that restores or improves barrier functions in humans can alter the natural history of the disease. So they're saying like, okay, well, these therapies that you're giving to restore the intestinal function may do that and also fight the disease in a different way that you don't know about, which could be true. There's no way to prove that. Well, like, how would you prove that that's not the case? So I guess to prove that, you would have to like somehow keep the intestinal barrier damaged while offering that treatment and seeing if there's improvement in the symptoms. And that's going to be hard to pull off in humans because you're not supposed to harm people intentionally in studies. That's an ethical no-no, and we don't do that anymore. So we have a comparison between popular sources that are done through search engine optimization through Google, where we have, these doctors that are coming out on WebMD saying, there's no proof of any of this stuff or whatever. And then once you dig deeper into the entrails of the internet, you're finding these peer-reviewed published studies that show a lot of evidence. So for me, I think that we need to do a better job of sourcing information and getting information out to people, because some of these websites and some of the way that the search engine optimization works is that it favors some of these established groups that are not digging into the literature enough. And if you're constantly promoting the establishment and not promoting any of the contrary opinions or the new data that's coming up or any of that stuff, you're always going to be left with the same answers to the questions, even if those answers are wrong. So we need to work on updating and improving information as it's coming out, and making sure that and some of these popular websites like WebMD are not necessarily going to update their information on their own. They're going to be stuck using obsolete information or just saying, oh, we don't know, therefore it's not true. And that's really not a good thing. So I hope you enjoyed this video on leaky gut and looking at two different points of view from WebMD and from peer-reviewed research. And you can kind of see the difference in quality, hopefully, after me going over all of this. And next, maybe we'll go over some more features of leaky gut, and maybe I'll show some more research that we can uncover that supports the theory of leaking gut causing lots of problems in the body, how to address it, the therapies and treatments that work. And a lot of this we've already written on, John and I, on FixYourGut.com. So for more information, definitely go there. Make sure that you hit the notification bell if you're a subscriber, because then you're going to get notified when a new video comes out. Otherwise, it may not end up coming in your feed. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit like. And that kind of helps get this information out there to other people, because again, as I went over, the way that the ranking system works with Google, and YouTube is a feature of Google, this video is not going to, on its own, be promoted very well if our community doesn't help get this information out by, feeding the algorithm, liking, subscribing, all that good stuff, so that we can hopefully help people that have leaky gut symptoms get better, which is the goal of this whole thing. So hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.